following is part of Cornell Contemporary China Initiative Lecture Series under the Cornell East Asia program. The arguments and viewpoints of this talk belong solely to the speaker. We hope you enjoy.
So I'm going to talk about the rise of psychological counseling and the impact on the self in China today. And I'll try not to bore you and keep you from sleeping. So you'll hear some stories, a little bit of theory, but some stories, ethnographic stories. So I'll be largely sort of reading here in the interest of time. If you have any questions, then we'll save at the end, okay? So as middle-class Chinese are accumulating material wealth and also build up the private so-called the paradise in gated communities, they also realize that their gains do not necessarily endow them with a deeper sense of fulfillment and happiness. So faced with increasing market competition, rapid social change, and the pressure to become successful, 成功, many of them are also experiencing different degrees of anxiety, stress, and confusion. Although I think it's very hard to identify a direct causal relationship between recent transformations and the rising popularity of psychological counseling and the mental health. This is the broad context in which a new mass counseling movement is unfolding in China. A new language, therapeutic language of personal emotions and self-mastery is also being introduced to Chinese society, reshaping the way the self and the individual psyche are conceived in China today. So this phenomenon obviously raises a lot of important questions about how Chinese people manage their mental well-being and understand themselves when family bonds and social ties have become fragile in the economic reform years. So during the summers from 2010 to 2016, I went back to the city of Kunming in southwestern China. It's also my hometown to conduct ethnographic research in order to understand how this rising psych fever is transforming selfhood, quality of life, and also techniques of governing in China. So this is, Kunming, right, Yunnan province, and Kunming is a provincial city. When I was there, I was affiliated with the Provincial Health Education Institute and also 2 private counseling firms. I interviewed many therapists, their clients, and observed several private counseling sessions, which is difficult to do, and also participated in a number of therapist training workshops there. So this is part of a larger project, my book, Robin mentioned. So the book explores 3 sets of major questions. The first is the changing technologies of the self. Second, the relationship between cultural and the psychotherapy. And the third, the intersection between emerging therapeutic governing and post-socialist governing. But today, I will only focus on the first question of the self, right? By examining how psychological training and therapeutic interventions play a vital part in the urban middle class project of self-making. So here I just want to mention also the new middle class in China is an emergent, very fragment, amorphous social group, so largely defined by their home ownership and consumption practices. Okay, so it's a very fluid category without any fixed boundaries. It's very hard to pin down by using any sort of income criteria. So I want to explore how this amorphous group, the middle class, actually now turn the notion 自我, for those of you who understand Chinese, 自我, the self, into an object of intense inquiry, and how various therapeutic projects are used to achieve self-development and personal fulfillment. So this is the focus of my talk today. I will show you that the newly crafted self here, through psychotherapeutic technologies, continue, however, to intersect with and complicate existing notions of the self in China, the social nexus, cultural sensibilities. So a therapeutic self in China is both an individual self, but also a social self. My ethnography focuses on how the therapeutic work contributes to intricate forms of self-making that challenge such binaries. For example, we know all those binaries, the private versus the social self, the inner versus outer life, psychological versus social problems. So I want to challenge these binaries here. Why this new regime of the self is becoming a very profitable industry and bears certain key traits of neoliberalism in China, for example, promoting self-governance and self-reliance. It also dovetails very well with the post-reform regime's project of building a harmonious society that underscores conflict reduction. So what's emerging here is not a usual neoliberalism story of self-advancement, but a much more complicated story here. Self-practices here, while very much influenced by global psychotherapeutics, are still very much rooted in Chinese history and culture and have very important political implications. So let me just move on to, these are the several sections I'm going to go through today. The first part, of therapeutic technologies of the self, I'll quickly review some of the theories and literatures that animate this research. So medical and psychological anthropologists have shown that therapeutic interventions have a significant impact on the conceptions of personhood and selfhood, identity formation, and the politics of citizenship. For example, well-known medical anthropologist Lawrence Kamayer offers an insightful analysis of the interplay between therapeutic techniques and cultural concepts of the person in specific time and space. And also building on Foucault, some of you may have read him, Foucault's notion of the generalization of psychiatric power. Nicholas Rose, another well-known theorist, elaborates on the broad impact of what he calls the psychological complex in social and political domains. Rose demonstrates how psychotherapy offers a technical means to reform a self and promote a mode of governance premised on self-management. But the self is not a pre-given. Instead, it's formed always through social recognition. So self-cultivation is a changing process shaped by negotiating with social expectations, duties, and norms. So it's not a static thing. Drawing on these insights, here I want to address 3 questions in this talk. First, why is the self granted extraordinary salience among China's middle class today? And second, what specific projects of self-development and self-care are emerging in the wake of mass psych education, training, and counseling? Third, what new technologies of the self are created and for what ends? So here quickly, I won't read this, how I define technologies of the self. It's very much, this is a quotation from Foucault's writing. Okay, so, but I would not read here. You can take a quick look at it. The question of selfhood and self-cultivation, of course, has a long genealogy in Chinese history. So this is not the place to kind of launch a detailed discussion, but it's worth pointing out that there are some important continuities and discontinuities in the way the self is conceived and nurtured in China. So the concern with self-improvement has long been an important element in Confucianism. For example, a central Confucian notion, 修身, meaning cultivating one's moral character through embodiment, suggests that the self, which includes both the body and the soul is an object that can be worked on, reshaped, and improved over time. Yet the ethical self is not isolated or abstract, but is always deeply embedded in multiple social layers and manifested through bodily conduct. So that's very distinct in China. It's not just an abstract spirit or soul. The Confucian discourses on self-cultivation in the past also has a clear class and gender dimension because this lifelong project was primarily for elite men only in the past. Now, under Maoist socialism, the concern of selfhood was largely eclipsed by the concern of collective well-being and the party-state's projects. So this, however, does not mean that the self ceased to exist under socialist China. Rather, the exploration of the self was largely folded into revolutionary causes, collective production, and nation building. So in the post-Mao era, after Mao died, we're talking about the current era, serious inquiries of the self re-emerged in the realm of literature and literary criticism first. It resurged in recent waves of popular psych fever, 心理热. The emphasis now in this fever is on the understanding and mastery of the self through what's deemed as modern and scientific psychological methods. The ability to manage the self through an emerging therapeutic culture now becomes a new criteria to measure one's worth, social worth. Yet the reconfiguration of selfhood should not be read, I think, as the rise of an individualist self against a collectively oriented self. So this is one of the main arguments I want to make here. It has been widely acknowledged that Chinese notions of personhood are deeply embedded in larger social relationships, including the family, kinship, neighborhoods, and work units. The production of persons is realized in a relational process by constantly creating and maintaining social ties, as well as cultivating socially accepted behaviors. So over the past 2 decades, however, this socially embedded selfhood has been undergoing profound transformations. But it would be a mistake to assume that recent changes somehow indicate a move towards a discrete self, as some people have suggested. Ethnographic evidence suggests that the search for ziwo, for the self, and the personal happiness today is still very much entangled with social obligations, socialist ethics, and local cultural values. As Nicholas Rose, the scholar I quote earlier, has reminded us in a different context, quote, our contemporary regime of self is not anti-social. It construes the relationship of the self with lovers, family, children, friends, and colleagues as central to both personal happiness and social efficacy, unquote. Okay. So I propose to move beyond even divided self versus the collective by unraveling the constant articulation and negotiation between the self and the social. It's this constant, interaction I'm interested in. In so doing, we need to probe ethnographically how some Chinese people actually experience the psychologization of the self and negotiate the tensions that rise in this process. So I believe understanding such intimate experience and personal struggles will enable us to better grasp the extent and the cultural meanings of China's broader social transformations. I think a lot of people have written about China's economic changes and reform, political scientists, economists. We know a lot about the structure changes, but we know very little about their inner landscape, how their mind changed. So this is my aim here. Now, let me talk a little bit about the psych fever, I call it, some background information, the context in which my project takes place. Since the 1990s, a new psych fever, which includes the learning of psychology, mental health, education, group therapy, private counseling has been sweeping Chinese cities. This is in stark contrast with the time under Mao's regime, where research and the teaching of psychology and psychiatry was largely suspended. And mental health, mental illness was regarded at that time simply as a result of wrong political thinking. And at that time also psychiatry was very much limited to treating acute psychosis in a few mental hospitals. So since the late 1990s, the popular psych industry is flourishing. Numerous books and magazines on related topics are published, like this one, very popular, Psychologies. And countless websites on psychological well-being and services are also mushrooming today. If you just do a quick search, Google search, tons of them, hundreds of thousands of them will show up. And international, this is like in the bookstore now you walk in, you have all this huge, section on psychology. And the international psych experts are frequently also invited to lecture in China, often attracting large crowds. I'm talking about the hundreds of sometimes several thousand people. Mostly young mothers and professional women who are eager to learn how to live a happier life and also how to educate their children, communicate with their family. This is a Harvard lecturer. Ben Shahar, he is really, really popular. He's popular in Harvard. I heard that his class is the largest one, 500 students, called The Science of Happiness. He wrote this book and it's been translated into China, one of the best sellers in China. Schools, enterprises, and the police, and even the military are increasingly keen to incorporate modern psychological techniques in creating and maintaining a stable, resilient, and a productive workforce. The Chinese state, of course, has played a very important role in this psych fever. So I just want to mention two things they did. First, the state-run Central Chinese Television Station, CCTV, launched a widely watched late-night show called The Psychological Consultation, 心理访谈, in 2005. It has played a critical role in popularizing psychological counseling and reducing the stigma attached to mental illness. So this is one of the shows, typical a host and an expert, usually a psychotherapist with the clients. This is a family here. And second, in 2003, the state also launched a national certification program through which many young urbanites of diverse background can finish the required training courses in 2 or 3 months, pass the exam, and obtain their counseling license. So I was contemplating taking that exam, but it requires a lot of memorization. It's actually hard. So these are the young people who just obtained their license. Over the past 10 years, some 100,000 Chinese have been certified through this program. And this is like what I call the speedy assembly line-like program, right? You go through that very fast. But only less than 15% of them actually go into private practice of counseling. So why do so many Chinese people flock to counseling training, yet so few become a full-time therapist? And what do they hope to gain from such seemingly impractical training? So the answer actually partly lies in the growing desire among the middle class to refashion themselves by simultaneously pursuing this notion of self-actualization and redirecting self-management in relation to their family and personal relationships. So that's part of that mystery, because so many people got the license, but they're not practicing. So the next section I'm moving, so I'm going to tell you some ethnographic stories. Right? The next section is called the doing self-work. What doing self-work is involved here. Okay, so I first met Zhang at a tea house near the Green Lake in 2014. She was a part-time therapist in her early 40s, and she has a college degree and holds a well-respected position at the local provincial government agency. So for her, entering the psych sector was very accidental, yet it was a journey of life discovering and self-healing. So as we were enjoying a cup of tea there, she began to tell me her story of personal transformations. This is her voice, quote, 7 years ago, one day as I was reading a newspaper, I saw an advertisement on psychotherapy training classes offered by the Provincial Health Bureau. I had no idea that there existed such a field and occupation. I had always liked to listen to my friends' problems, but did not know how to help them. So I thought I would enroll in the program and learn something to help my friends. The classes lasted for 3 months and I passed the certification exam easily. But in this process, I began to realize that I was deeply troubled by many unresolved issues and I myself needed help, unquote. So the program Julie enrolled was very typical. It was a crammed program that involves many topics in a short period of time. So at that time, she was facing a set of misfortunes and challenges in her life. During the 2 prior years, her father had fallen ill and become bedridden at home. Her daughter was born with Down syndrome, and her husband's firm, the private firm, went into bankruptcy. Yeah, it can't get worse than that, huh? Yet she tried to bottom up all her distress and confusion inside her by keeping herself busy. In studying psychological theories and counseling, she came to realize that she must do her own homework. It's a very Chinese expression, 做自己的功课. By allowing herself to explore who she was and what she wanted and giving the opportunity to cleanse her mind. So after careful consideration, she made a bold decision. She hired a living domestic worker to take care of her father and daughter and left home with a backpack and embarked on a 2-year journey to Tibet. The choice of a destination was not accidental. Tibet, in many Chinese people's mind, stands for a place of unworthiness and purity. And she also describes this journey as a spiritual, physical, and psychological expedition. Her goal was to disentangle herself, temporarily at least, from the web of family and other social obligations in order to reclaim a more resilient self capable of accepting life as is. So she explained to me, quote, no therapist can heal others if she cannot heal herself first. Her mind must be like a body of lucid, tranquil water in order to reflect upon other people's lives and help them untie the knots of the soul, unquote. So Zhu's story is a narrative of self-care and self-development widely shared by those who are drawn to counseling. During my research, countless informants recounted the moments of their self-enlightenment brought by their work on the self. They eagerly explained to me how they found clarity in their mind, how their depression was lifted, and how their anxiety decreased. They tend to attribute these positive changes to therapeutic work on the self and saw it as a pivotal healing project. So this work, of course, involves both psychological work, effort, but also physical activities. So this is also very distinct in China. People believe you cannot just talk and work on your mind. You have to also involve physical regimens, works. So as a self-fashioned counselor and educator told me, his journey of self-discovery and struggle over depression consisted of 2 intertwined parts: psychotherapy training and daily long-distance walking. So, quote, he said, "I have been walking over 20 kilometers every day between my home and work for several years. This journey, along with my therapeutic experience, has not only strengthened my physical body, but also, more important, transformed my psyche," unquote. So you can see the relationship there, right? So that physical well-being and mental well-being cannot be separated reflects a common view shared by many Chinese. So rather than focusing on somatization, this is a term Arthur Kleinman, the Harvard anthropologist, used, meaning you attribute all your physical illness, psychological illness to physical problems. So rather than doing that, now urban Chinese increasingly emphasize the mutually constitutive processes of the physical and the mental health. So American writer Barbara Ehrenreich once depicted the new psychology that gained wide popularity in 1970s America as, quote, both an industry and a kind of secular religion, enlisting hundreds of thousands of middle-class Americans in the project of self-improvement through psychological growth, unquote. So this observation is quite telling about what's happening in China today. While the teaching of self-growth and self-improvement is becoming a popular profitable industry catered to middle-class Chinese, it also carries a very strong flavor of religious almost zeal in pursuit of self-salvation. So this industry, combining therapeutics, secular, religious spirit, and business operations. Sometimes literally they run like a business, like a McDonald's franchise, some of the counseling firms, is expanding like a wildfire. So for example, this is a self-growth workshop held at a local resort I attended several of those. And also advertisement on workshops by psych experts are also mushrooming. For example, these are typical advertisements you will see on the website and the workshops. It's all, the emphasis is all on the self, working on the self-growth, the self-fulfillment. So although the psych fever foregrounds self-queries and self-improvement, the ultimate goal here is to create an enhanced self that can handle family relations and social relations better and thus live a good life. So it's not actually all about just retreating back to the self. It's about being more capable of dealing with also social relationships. So the new self is not an assertion of individualism, but the refashioning of a person who is better at managing one's own emotion and the social nexus, right? So I call this two simultaneous processes as disentangling and re-embedding, which I will explain next through a story. In a July morning of 2010, I was sitting in a small conference room with 3 men and 5 women, all in their 20s and 30s, at a 3-day intense workshop on Sandplay therapy organized by a local training center called Xinling. So this was created by a private vocational school specialized in training people for obtaining various kinds of certificates. So it provides post-exam advanced training for those who obtained their certificate. But if you want to have more advanced training, this is a Sandplay therapy. I don't know, any of you have seen those? If you have ever, it's very popular in China. Yeah, I attended all those workshops. Now, this young man and woman had recently passed the certification exam after taking the prep classes there. Now, during the self-introduction period, I had learned that all of them there actually had a regular job. 3 school teachers, 1 policeman, 2 state agency employees, and 2 private firm employees. So they were not there looking for a job, right? During the long tea break, we engaged in an animated conversation. I asked why they were there and what they hoped to achieve through this program. So I quickly learned that most of them sought psych training as a form of self-development to improve their life quality and the chance to succeed. So Xiao Wang, a female middle school teacher, put this way, quote, "For me, studying psychology and counseling is a way of understanding myself and my own issues better so that I can understand the social world around me." And of course, financial consideration was also another factor. So even though the fees for enrolling in the classes and exams are not small, generally it costs about 3,000 to 4,000 yuan. So the exchange rate is about 1 to 6 with US dollars. And for Chinese people, that's a lot of money. That's about a high school teacher's monthly salary, right? They reasoned that they could master the tool of solving one's own problem and gain a deeper understanding of oneself through systematic learning better. And this is cheaper than going for professional counseling, which costs about 300 to 400 yuan per session. So if you need 10 sessions, that's there, right? So then our conversation turned to the question of ziwo, the self. I asked them to explain what this concept meant to them and whether and how their understanding of it had changed over time. Here I will briefly discuss 3 cases for you. The first one is a woman, Wan Qing. She is a divorced mother in her 30s with an 8-year-old daughter. She used to work for a real estate firm selling housing units. Although the income was not bad, the work was highly demanding. So after she got divorced, she decided to quit the real estate job so she could spend more time with her daughter. She implied that she had saved enough money and got some money from the divorce. 2 years ago, she started an after-school care program at home, helping 8 children with their lunch and homework. This is a popular practice in China due to parents' busy work schedule. So this home care brought in enough income for her while allowing her to spend more time to take care of her daughter. The reason why she was studying psychology and counseling, she said, is to help myself and guide my child to grow better. And she was quite confident in articulating her understanding of the self. So you listen to her view, and it's very different from the next 2. So, quote, she said, "Ziwo is like a circle demarcating the boundary between one's own self and others. I try to teach my 8-year-old daughter how to draw this line and respect the boundary. For example, she likes to go through my purse for fun," she said. So I tell her that a purse is a private belonging and she must get my approval before handling it. She must know the boundary between ziwo, the self, and others. And this is the first step towards personal growth, unquote. I was like, whoa, yeah. Okay, my daughter goes through my purse all the time. So anyway, her view of the self as a demarcated entity was intriguing because most people I met in China did not speak in this term. She also placed great importance on the notion of boundaries between the self and the others. Now, her interpretation of a private self formed a sharp contrast with another trainee there, Lu Mingxing, a 25-year-old temporary junior high school teacher and a former army soldier. Within the workshop, Lu was the one most concerned about the social acceptance. He passionately declared to the group, quote, "Anyone who enters the world must be recognized and accepted by society. Only when the society acknowledges me, there can exist the self. If you are not connected with the society and the people around you, how can you have a true self, true ziwo," unquote. But he also admitted that he was fascinated by the psychological exploration of the self. But focusing on one's feeling and reflecting one's own inner experiences was very unsettling and difficult to him. So he told us, "I came from a mountainary village in Guizhou province. My family was poor and I did not have much education. In the military, I always felt inferior to others. So I tried to follow the orders and win the recognition and approval of others. When I first began studying psychological counseling, my goal was to obtain the skills to help my students and improve my teaching. But soon I realized that I wanted to understand myself, even though the concept of ziwo is quite alien to me, and sometimes I just cannot focus on myself, unquote. So he had a lot of difficulty narrating his feeling during the workshop. He constantly refers to how he might be viewed and judged by his fellow soldiers and the co-workers, and was very disturbed by the fact that he was often uncertain whether his behavior was acceptable by others. So he reminded me of my parents' generation that grew up under socialism and largely sought social conformity, so conformity was more important. Right? Yet another part of him also wanted to explore this domain inside him, right? So he hoped that self-work somehow would enable him to craft a new person, a new kind of person capable of engaging in the social world better. Now, the most intriguing case is my encounter with Feng, a 33-year-old city police officer. So he was a bit shy with a touch of melancholia. We met at the workshop and later became good friends because we shared a special moment when I was assigned as his therapist and he was the client. We had to do this role playing back and forth. So that was a very special moment. The sandbox, you have to make arrangement, free play, whatever you want to do. So the sandbox arrangement he created was remarkably telling. It was a desert scene with a red snake right here, stranded kind of like in sand. Nearby, there was a cluster of green, some kind of a green, he said, cactus and a jade horn. It's a jade horn. It took me a long time, like 20-some minutes, to put this very simple scene together. And then there was dead silence for 5 minutes. We were sitting there face to face. Finally, he murmured, quote, "I feel that the snake is very lonely and stuck there. He is trying to move forward towards the green plants, perhaps an oasis in the desert, but it's very dry. But he's very tired and will probably never get there," unquote. So at that time, I did not know much about his personal circumstance, but I could sense a great deal of emotion and tension. So I asked, "Does this scene speak to your current situation?" Unquote. He nodded and tears came rolling down. So it was the first time I played in this role. It was very shocking and I didn't know what to do. That's part of the training is you don't know what to do when people actually opened up to you and cry, right? And he said, "This snake is just like me. I never had the chance to look at myself like this before," unquote. I learned later that he was a plainclothes policeman catching pocket pickers on city buses. This work was highly demanding and sometimes dangerous, yet his supervisor did not trust him and accused him of slacking off. He was under a great deal of stress and felt resentful. And when he began to take counseling classes in his spare time, his parents-in-law, who also lived with his family, could not understand why a man like him, a policeman, would need to study psychology and complained frequently. His wife, a full-time office worker, was supportive of his study, but also needed his help in taking care of their infant baby. So he said, "I come home after work feeling exhausted, but I'm expected to help my wife wash baby diapers and do housework. My parents-in-law think I'm just lazy if I needed some rest. They also believed that studying psychological counseling was impractical, a waste of time. I was under so much pressure at work and home, and I do not have a moment for myself. I'm stuck and feeling very lonely," unquote. So he then commented on how much he cherished the moments he had recently crafted for himself to look deeper into his own psyche through all this counseling training. Attending to his anguish and opening up his feeling to others in this kind of therapeutic settings was the first step towards healing for him, even though this was often a very painful experience. As a police officer, he was often expected to be strong and not to talk about his feeling, but the therapy training gave him a safe space to explore his inner fear and desire. So he was able to look into himself deeply while reaching out for help from the mentor and the fellow trainee. So this provides a nice safe social space for him. At the end of our session, he told me that the green plants he placed there represented hope and the faith. Quote, "I'm not sure where it is yet, but I have a feeling that I have begun to see sparks of faith in this rather despaired situation, and that's why I keep crawling like this snake," unquote. So later on, Feng also articulated his view of the self in this way to me. So he said, 自我, the self, has two layers of meaning. One is 当下的我, the self that's living in this moment, and is deeply embedded in the complex nexus of family, kinship, and society. The other is the primeval self, detached from the reality and can only emerge from time to time when I'm alone in meditation. I'm longing for the disentangled self, but at the same time cannot abandon the socially embedded self because both together make me human, unquote. I thought it was a really powerful statement there. So this statement this statement highlights the complexity of the self as a relational and dynamic process, constantly being constituted and reconstituted through different layers of sociality and desire. So 2 years later, I revisited him and found his personal situation improved greatly. He continued to study psychological counseling in his spare time and engage in the self project. So he said, I have learned to adjust my mindset constantly, which help enhance my family and work relations. Even though I cannot change the reality, I'm much better at seeing different options and deciding how to respond, unquote. So he was also at that time volunteering at a small private counseling firm to offer free service to students with psychological troubles. And he found that work very fulfilling. So these three cases illustrate heterogeneous ways of conceiving the self through therapeutic work in urban China. So the first one, Wan Qing stressed the importance of the private self and maintaining the boundary. Yet she was also aware that the formation of this private self was relational and thus could not be isolated from the social world, right? The second, Lu Mingxing advocated a model of selfhood as one deeply rooted in and shaped by interpersonal dynamics and social norms. Disentangling the self from others, even for a moment, was unsettling to him. The third one, Feng Gang's notion of self-work is more sophisticated. First, it requires the act of disentanglement so that the inner self can find a space of healing and regain clarity. Yet the work does not stop there. The new self cultivated by psychotherapy needs to be re-embedded back into the social world. So from this perspective, the social and the self, the inner and the outer, constitute a dialogic relationship that strengthens one another rather than oppose one another. Yet all three of them have faith in psychological work, seeing it as an effective tool for reforming the self. Thus, self-efficacy and social efficacy here become one and the same project that promises to bring happiness, success, and fulfillment. So many of my informants echo this view as they witness therapeutic work on the self, producing positive effects on their family and social lives. So let me offer a few final remarks, kind of a concluding remarks here. So for many urban Chinese, 自我 becoming an object that one can adjust and improve with the psychotherapeutic technologies. The relationship between the self and the social nexus remains a key problematic one must tackle. It's not easy to negotiate this relationship. I have identified a distinctive dual process here I called disentangling and re-embedding as central to the working of this new therapeutic self in China. But here, let me just briefly mention 3 important features about this new emerging therapeutic culture in China. First, there exist multiple notions of the self here, right? Traditional, socialist, neoliberal, whatever you want to term them, but you can see clearly there are different orientations here. And they are very much coexist and entangled with one another. So individuals in China today must navigate through this plurality and try to make sense of all these different forms of the self that coexist. So people oftentimes get very confused, actually, especially young people there. Moreover, therapeutic engagement with self-work is becoming an important tool for enhancing one's self-worth and well-being, as well as a promise for living the good life. So while in the early reform years, 1980s through 1990s, material wealth was the prominent marker of status. Today, I say health and well-being are becoming much more important to register now. Second, personal narratives of feelings and life histories are also essential in the cultivating the new self here. As Bradley Lewis, psychiatrist actually puts it, quote, "These culturally located stories, self-stories, and the priorities within these stories combine with other cultural stories to scaffold our narrative identity and provide us with a compass for living." So these narratives here, I'm telling you, people's stories are actually a very important part of their compass for living. A common theme that emerged in all these narratives is that individuals often started to engage in psychotherapeutic work out of curiosity or the need to help others, right? But then discovered that they themselves need to do self-work. So talk therapy training, as conducted in China, mostly in this kind of a small group fashions, offer a unique opportunity for participants to share self-stories and experiment on self-remaking. But the overall emphasis here, as you can see, I think is also very interesting to China, is not to treat mental illness here, but to enhance well-being and the quality of life. Although, some people do use that to treat mental illness, but that's actually not the majority of what people are doing there with psychology and the counseling. And the third, this regime of self-work has a clear class and gender character. The primary consumers of this new industry are members of the urban middle classes, and a large portion of them are women. The working class, the poor, or those on the margin of the society are largely left out because they either do not have time or money to embrace these new experiments. It's striking, that women take up nearly 80% of the participants at the self-worth workshop and training classes I've attended. And many Chinese therapists I interviewed also reported a very, very high percentage of female presence. Perhaps this is partly due to the lasting gender expectation that women are primarily responsible for taking care of the emotional and the family life and family relations. So what's new here is that urban Chinese women today somehow have the possibility of acquiring a professional, almost like a toolbox they are learning, a toolbox here, and not just their instincts to take charge of their own emotion and their family life. While the new therapeutic culture provides a unique and safe space for self-exploration, its impact goes far beyond the personal realm. I don't have time to go into that, but it certainly has very, very important political implications here too. So while my research shows that this culture of self-engagement is emerging outside the Euro-American societies, it takes a distinct form in a context that has its own deep cultural and historical understanding here. So they don't just embrace the psychotherapy, Western psychotherapy wholeheartedly, but really try to integrate them, adapt them to the Chinese cultural context. And finally, this new self-work dovetail I mentioned with the Party States project of building a socialist harmonious society. So in this context, government officials and social scientists have also come to embrace what's called the positive psychology. Don't know whether some of you have heard of that, positive psychology. Despite the critique of its lack of some moral map and reluctance to tackle structural problems, such self-work regarded by many Chinese experts to have the potential to broaden social interventions by improving citizens' emotional outlook and fostering a sense of satisfaction. So with the help of psych experts, Chinese people today are told it is possible to turn their social problems and suffering into a technical matter of sound personal choice and self-management. So yeah, thank you.